Horror is a genre often misunderstood and misconstrued, but one that has endured for hundreds of years. Join me as I explore historic literary horror and the writers and works that shaped the genre into what it is today. I'm Kit Claremont. Welcome to the Literary Horror Archive. I think most people in the United States are familiar with the legend of Sleepy Hollow, but did you know that early American horror writer Washington Irving based the story on his own experiences? Born in Manhattan in 1783, Irving was a well-known author, satirist, essayist, and historian, and he was briefly the U.S. ambassador to Spain from 1842 to 1846. He was born the same week that New Yorkers learned of the ceasefire that ended the American Revolution, and his mother named him after General and future First President George Washington. Despite Irving's cleverness, he was a lazy student and much more interested in reading adventure stories and attending the theater than anything else. He struggled to distinguish himself among his large merchant family and was, at least in his early years, considered something of a dilettante. In the summer of 1798, there was an outbreak of yellow fever in the city, which prompted his parents to send him to stay with his friend, a fellow writer, James Paulding, in Tarrytown, New York, which is upstate. That trip was the beginning of Irving's obsession with early Dutch settlers and the Catskill Mountains, which would deeply influence him for the rest of his life. After an extended tour of Europe from 1803 to 1806, where Irving ingratiated himself as a notable wit among fashionable society, he returned to New York and studied law under Josiah Ogden Hoffman. He barely passed the bar, and he was more interested in writing pieces for the literary magazine Salmagundi that he, his brother William, and his friend James Paulding founded in 1807. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, there's an artist club in Greenwich Village that's called the Salmagundi Club, which was founded in the early 1870s and which likely took the name from the title of the magazine, though Irving himself had been dead for about a decade before it was founded. Salmagundi was a satire magazine similar to something like National Lampoon or Mad Magazine, and Irving and his friends wrote humorous pieces under a variety of silly pen names, including William Wizard and Lancelot Longstaff. Surprisingly, Salmagundi proved to be a huge success, and that's when Irving's career really began to take off. He gave New York City the nickname Gotham in the magazine's 17th issue in 1807 and published his first full-length book, A Satirical History of New York, under the name of Diedrich Knickerbocker in 1809. And yes, the slang term Knickerbocker for residents of New York took its inspiration from Irving's pen name, as did the name of basketball team the New York Knicks. Also, I do acknowledge that while in the DC universe Gotham City is technically located in New Jersey, Washington Irving's reference predates the DC claim by about 133 years, so we're going to go with Gotham being New York. Around the time Irving published his first book, he was also mourning the death of his young fiancée, Matilda Hoffman. Matilda, the daughter of his legal mentor, Josiah Ogden Hoffman, had made such an impression on Irving that he decided to focus on his legal career in order to support her. Unfortunately, he was not cut out to be a lawyer, and although Salmagundi was popular, the magazine didn't really generate enough income for Irving to make a living. So Irving threw himself into writing a history of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, one of several of his creations with exceedingly long titles, I might add. But he didn't complete the book before Matilda succumbed to tuberculosis on April 26, 1809. Unfortunately, the two of them never made it to the altar. Irving wrote of Matilda, "Never did I meet with more intuitive rectitude of mind, more native delicacy, more exquisite propriety in word, thought, and action than in this young creature. For my part, I idolized her." Years after her death, he was also quoted as saying, "I cannot tell you what a horrid state of mind I was in for a long time. I seemed to care for nothing. The world was blank to me. There was a dismal horror continually in my mind that made me fear to be alone. I tried to form other attachments, but my heart would not hold on. It would continually recur to what I had lost. For years I could not talk on the subject of this hopeless regret. I could not even mention her name, but her image was continually before me, and I dreamt of her incessantly." Irving promoted A History of New York, which is how I'm going to refer to it from now on because the title is really long, He promoted it with something very similar to an ARG. For those of you unfamiliar, ARG stands for Alternate Reality Game, and an ARG is an interactive narrative experience that takes place in the real world using various forms of media to transmit clues for participants to decipher. In Irving's case, he plays several missing persons classified ads in the New York Evening Post, seeking a fictional Dutch historian named Diederik Knickerbocker who had vanished from his hotel in Manhattan before paying his bill. Posing as the hotel's proprietor, Irving threatened to publish Knickerbocker's manuscript that the historian had mistakenly left behind if he didn't return to the hotel and pay his bill. This marketing scheme was so compelling that some New York City officials even offered monetary rewards for Knickerbocker's safe return. When released in December of 1809, A History of New York was wildly successful, and Irving suddenly found himself catapulted into the spotlight. The book's success landed Irving a job as editor at Analectic magazine, where he wrote numerous biographies and printed Francis Scott Key's Defense of Fort McHenry, the poem that would eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner. After much toil and struggle, it seemed that Washington Irving had finally arrived. Unfortunately, a lot of his success would be undone by the War of 1812, when merchant families like Irving's own suffered financial hardship during the conflict. Despite being a member of New York's militia, the War of 1812 did unsalvageable damage to Irving's family firm. He left the U.S. for England in 1815 in a last-ditch effort to save his family from financial ruin. After 2 years of pouring his own finances into the rapidly failing business, the Irving family was forced to declare bankruptcy. Because of this, Washington Irving would not return to the United States for 17 more years. During his time in England, Irving continued writing, and he composed the short story Rip Van Winkle while visiting his sister and her husband in Birmingham in 1818. That's Birmingham, England, not Birmingham, Alabama. The story's title character is a Dutch-American man who lives at the foot of the Catskill mountain range prior to the American Revolution. Known to be exceedingly lazy, Rip Van Winkle is chastised by his wife, and he decides to avoid further confrontation by vanishing into the forest to hunt. While there, he becomes lost until he hears someone mysteriously calling his name. Following the voice, Rip Van Winkle comes across a man wearing old-fashioned Dutch clothing. The man convinces Rip to help him carry a keg to a cleft in the mountain where they hear a strange rumbling sound. Once inside the cleft, the noise is revealed to be a large group of men, all dressed in the same archaic clothing, who are playing ninepins, which is an early precursor to bowling. Rip, being a deeply uncurious person, doesn't question who these men are or how they know his name, and he is easily convinced to drink with them. He drinks so much that he passes out, only to wake again after sleeping for 20 years. When Rip wakes up, he stumbles back to his village to discover that his wife and many of his friends are dead, that the country has completely changed after the Revolutionary War, and that his children are fully grown with families of their own. After telling his miraculous tale to one of the village elders, the old man explains that the men he met in the mountain are ghosts of the Half Main, or Half Moon, a ship once belonging to the Dutch East India Company. And if you're wondering how the crew of a ghost ship ended up in a cave in the Catskill Mountains, this is never really explained, though it's probably prudent to mention that the real Half Main sailed up the Hudson River as far as Albany before turning around and heading back to the Netherlands. Rip seems completely unfazed by all of this, and he resumes a life of leisure under his children's care, telling his strange tale whenever someone new visits the village. After a while, the villagers begin to joke that every time they hear thunder, it must be the ghosts of the Half Main playing ninepins in the mountains. In 1819, Irving sent Rip Van Winkle to his brother Ebenezer in New York. He asked him to publish the story as the first installment of the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman, which was a serial. The sketchbook, as the series came to be known, consisted of 7 installments of short fiction published between 1819 and 1820. Once again, Irving used a pen name to publish his work, this time taking on the persona of Geoffrey Crayon, a witty scholar whose personality was as big a selling point as the tales themselves. After the success of Rip Van Winkle, the rest of the series was popular and well received, and Irving would go on to publish The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in the 6th installment. Of the 34 works included throughout the 7 installments, only Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow can truly be regarded as horror tales. But despite that, Washington Irving has earned a lasting place in the history of early American horror literature. Podcasting is a rewarding but expensive hobby. Aside from the cost of equipment, software, and advertising budget, there's also a significant investment in time to make each episode come to life. Every episode takes days of research, script writing, recording, and editing before it's ever released to listeners. So while the Literary Horror Archive is a labor of love, and really my favorite way to share my special interests with strangers on the internet, we could really use some additional support. If you like what we do here, and you'd like to support the Literary Horror Archive, you can do this in a few different ways. 1. Spread the word about the Literary Horror Archive online. Discuss, comment, subscribe, repost, and share, and don't forget to mention it to your friends and family. 2. You can review the podcast wherever you happen to be listening, so that the great God algorithm continues to push episodes out to new listeners. And finally, 3. You can support us through our Patreon at patreon.com/literaryhorrorarchive. Our Patreon has exactly one membership tier for $1 a month, and it comes with benefits such as ad-free episodes, bloopers and outtakes, the ability to participate in polls regarding upcoming content, and the ability to suggest writers and stories for us to consider for future episodes. You'll also gain access to special patrons-only content, such as our yearly Halloween episode, which focuses on a specific horror trope in historic literature. Regardless of how you choose to support us, we're still happy to have you as a listener, and we hope that you continue to tune in to the Literary Horror Archive in the future. So, as much as I enjoy Rip Van Winkle, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was really my first introduction to the world of horror media. As a child, I watched with rapt attention the Disney animated version that aired every Halloween on the Disney Channel. And although the Disney cartoon does take some liberties with the story, as Disney kind of does with most of the literature it reproduces, there's still enough of a similarity that the tales aren't too distant from one another. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is set in the fictional village of Sleepy Hollow in upstate New York in 1790. Originally inspired by Tarrytown, where Washington Irving spent that long ago summer with James Kirk Paulding, Sleepy Hollow is a Dutch settlement in the Hudson River Valley. Amusingly, the city of North Tarrytown legally changed its name to Sleepy Hollow in 1996 to capitalize on the story's popularity and to help promote tourism to the area. In The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane, a fussy and superstitious schoolmaster, is terrorized by a ghostly figure of legend after riding home from a harvest festival party. The short story begins with the subtitle, "Found Among the Papers of the Late Diedrich Knickerbocker." So it seems like the missing Dutch historian from A History of New York has finally been found, but is rather worse for wear. Fortunately, he was gracious enough to narrate The Legend of Sleepy Hollow before his passing. Knickerbocker, in his role as the narrator, begins with a somewhat dreamy description of the peace and beauty of Sleepy Hollow and the strange metaphysical superstitions of its people. He then goes on to describe the legend of the spectral horseman, a Hessian soldier whose head was removed by a cannonball. Each night, the headless horseman rides toward the distant churchyard, where his body's buried, forever restless and seeking his missing head. This established, he introduces our main character, Ichabod Crane, a rather awkward but ambitious schoolteacher from Connecticut. In Irving's own words, he's described as tall but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served as shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. In describing Crane's personality, Knickerbocker mentions that he had a way of ingratiating himself among the community to make up for his poor wages as a schoolteacher, and he'd often help with their chores or care for their children outside of school hours. He was also the church choir master, an enthusiastic, if not particularly talented singer, and he was known for his love of gossip. Crane also deeply believed in the supernatural and witchcraft. He was a fan of Cotton Mather's A History of New England Witchcraft, which is another name for the wonders of the invisible world, and he collected tall tales and ghost stories from the older residents of the town. All of this combined made Crane extremely superstitious and exceptionally prone to jumping at shadows. He basically believed that anything and everything could be attributed to ghostly mischief. This established, Knickerbocker moves on to the meat of the story. Through his position as choir master, Ichabod meets Katrina Van Tassel, the beautiful and charming daughter of a wealthy landowner. Crane is immediately smitten and visits Katrina at her home, effectively falling in love with her family's wealth and prosperity. It's important to note that Katrina is described in a handful of lines in the story, while the Van Tassel farm is lovingly detailed in paragraph after paragraph. Although she might be lovely, what Crane most covets is her father's estate. Unfortunately for Crane, Katrina is a bit of a flirt and is heavily sought after by many other young men in the village. Ichabod's chief rival is a strapping troublemaker named Abraham Van Brunt, known better by his nickname, Brombones. Brombones is everything Ichabod Crane is not. He's masculine, boisterous, athletic, and an especially skilled horseman. You can think of him as sort of a proto-Gaston from Disney's Beauty and the Beast. Katrina is no belle, however, and she favors Brom over Crane. Despite this, Ichabod continues his pursuit of her, and in response, Brom and his friends wage a campaign of pranks against Ichabod in an attempt to dissuade him from courting Katrina. This rivalry comes to a head at a harvest party, or quilting frolic as it's called in the story, at the Van Tassel farm. Crane borrows a horse named Gunpowder from his landlord and sets out for the party. And I want to pause here to mention that Gunpowder is probably my favorite character in the story, assuming that a horse can be considered a character. He's old, bad-tempered, blind in one eye, has a heart full of malice, and I adore him. At any rate, Ichabod arrives at the party and then thoroughly enjoys himself. He spends a large portion of the evening dancing with Katrina and effectively being the life of the party while his rival sulks in a corner. It's never really explained why Brom isn't dancing. Maybe he's too rough around the edges to be good at it, or he just doesn't like it, but it's obvious that this is an area where Crane outshines him quite a bit. Once the dancing concludes, the partygoers begin telling ghost stories, and Brom sees his chance to steal the spotlight back from Ichabod. After hearing tales of the Headless Horseman, Brom adds his own, stating that he too had a run-in with the spectral Hessian, challenging him to a race that Brom nearly won, but the horseman then vanished in a flash of fire upon reaching the bridge to the churchyard. It's important to mention that Brom is very obviously joking here, but Crane takes him and the other tale-tellers very seriously. After the party breaks up, he lingers around for a while to have a private conversation with Katrina, but eventually he sets out from the Van Tassel farm in the middle of the night in a much more sour mood. Irving doesn't really detail what happens during this conversation between Ichabod and Katrina, but we can probably infer that Crane made some sort of romantic gesture and was spurned for it. So he climbs back onto Gunpowder and begins his long trek home in a funk. As he rides, he becomes increasingly anxious about the ghost stories that he heard earlier in the evening, and by the time he reaches a landmark, which is a huge, gnarled black tree, he is thoroughly spooked and jittery. He struggles to control Gunpowder the entire way home. The horse is basically trying to scrape him out of the saddle, and he eventually comes face to face with a shadowy figure mounted on a big black horse. Completely terrified, Ichabod spurs Gunpowder into action, but the figure is very easily able to keep up with him, riding parallel along the trail until they come to a patch of moonlight. Then Crane can see that the rider is indeed headless, and that something vaguely head-like is resting in its lap against the pommel of the saddle. That's more than enough for Ichabod, and he takes off, fighting to control Gunpowder the entire time. He eventually sees the bridge to the churchyard up ahead and thinks that if he makes it to the bridge, the horseman will disappear in a flash of fire like Brombones described. Instead, the figure rises from the saddle and hurls its head, quote-unquote, toward him, knocking him completely off the horse. The next morning, Gunpowder has made his way home alone, and Ichabod's hat is found on the banks of the river next to the remains of a shattered pumpkin. Ichabod himself is nowhere to be seen, however, and the town assumes he's been abducted by the Headless Horseman, because why wouldn't he be? They just sort of carry on with their lives after that, and Brombones marries Katrina Van Tassel. They tell stories of Ichabod's abduction whenever new people come to the town, and Brom basically just laughs hysterically when anyone mentions the pumpkin. And that's pretty much the end of the story, although there are rumors that Ichabod Crane ran away to become a justice of the peace in another town, or that he now haunts the disused schoolhouse where he once taught. They say in the dead of night, you can hear his distinctive voice carry across the field singing ghostly psalms. One of the things I like most about the legend of Sleepy Hollow is that Ichabod's reverence for superstition and ghost stories ends with him becoming one. The truth of what happened doesn't really matter to the townspeople, just the fact that the tale remains compelling. There's been significant speculation as to whether Irving based the character of Crane on one or more people, with many people championing his friend Jesse Merwin as the obvious inspiration. Well, this is certainly possible. Merwin was a respected schoolmaster who lived in the town of Kinderhook in the Hudson River Valley. Others are quick to point out that Ichabod Crane's actual namesake was a colonel in the U.S. Army that Irving happened to meet at Fort Pike while serving during the War of 1812. Then, of course, there are also similarities between Crane's appearance and that of Lockie Longlegs, very probably a nickname, a Scottish school teacher who Irving was introduced to by Sir Walter Scott and who was referenced in Irving's correspondence. In my personal opinion, Crane is probably a composite character, as are many of the other characters and locations mentioned in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. For example, Katrina Van Tassel, who Crane attempts to woo, might have been inspired by Eleanor Van Tassel Brush, who was a very popular and vivacious young woman who was acquainted with Irving's sister. Meanwhile, her aunt, Katrina Ecker Van Tassel, was probably the fictional namesake for Katrina. Similarly, Brom Bones Van Brunt, the story's main antagonist, could have been based on one of two local blacksmiths, both of which were nicknamed Brom, who lived and worked in the area. The first, Abraham Martling, was something of a local hero. He helped organize Tarrytown's forces during the American Revolution, including dipping behind enemy lines to retaliate when English forces burned down the house belonging to the real-world Van Tassel family. The other, Abram Van Alstyne, was an acquaintance of Jesse Merwin's who, according to local legend, conspired with others to prank Merwin in a manner very similar to Ichabod Crane in the story. Irving also incorporated bits of local history and folklore into his story to give it more color. As previously mentioned, there was a real-world Van Tassel family who resided in Tarrytown, and there was an Old Dutch church that may have served as inspiration for the story's church and churchyard. Several of the gravestones in the Old Dutch churchyard also bear names that Irving borrowed for fictional purposes. The area also has a historic connection to Hessian soldiers, as the Headless Horseman was rumored to be. During the Revolutionary War, the British Empire hired roughly 30,000 German mercenaries to fight against the American revolutionaries, and many of these soldiers were stationed in the Hudson River Valley. There's also a local legend in Tarrytown of Hessian soldiers setting fire to a home, potentially the Elizabeth Van Tassel house, which was burned to the ground in 1777, where a soldier from that company braved the flames to rescue a young girl who had become trapped in the home. Later, or so the legend goes, the same soldier lost his head to a cannonball. The girl's mother, wishing to repay the soldier's kindness, traveled back to the battlefield to bring back his body for proper burial, but was unable to locate his head. There are certainly aspects of the legend that are true. The Van Tassel house was actually set on fire, and according to Major William Heath, there actually was a Hessian soldier who lost his head and his horse to a cannonball in the nearby Battle of White Plains. There's also supposedly an unmarked grave of a Hessian soldier buried in the Old Dutch churchyard. However, the timelines don't quite match up. The Elizabeth Van Tassel house was burned in 1777, while the Hessian soldier in Major Heath's account lost his head in 1776. So, unless he time-traveled to the future to burn the house down, or his ghost did it but had his head at the time, it doesn't really make sense. So, while Irving pulled from local anecdotes, figures, and folklore to kind of help ground the story in reality, it's more likely that most of the characters, locations, and events in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow are largely fictional. Of course, this has also meant continuous speculation and numerous claims of this or that being the true inspiration for the tale. What's most likely is that Irving took inspiration from multiple sources, cobbling bits and pieces of truth together to create something that was entirely unique. Whatever the case, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow has become an important piece of colonial American history, and the tale continues to endure, as does the figure of Irving himself, cementing both their places as influential parts of the early American zeitgeist. Thank you for joining us, and please remember to like, subscribe, comment, or share wherever you happen to be listening. The Literary Horror Archive is written, edited, directed, and produced by Kit Claremont. Music used in this episode is Call of Fate by Alex Bess. The Literary Horror Archive releases new episodes twice a month every other Tuesday. Join us next time as we discuss Edith Wharton and her short story Afterward. Until then, stay spooky, friends.